Welcome to Boston Basic Income. This week's topic is utopianism. So to what extent is it helpful to think of basic income as a utopian ideal? So we hear criticism of UBI as being this kind of like unrealistic thing that can never happen in real life, kind of discredited as utopian. And then on the other side, there are people who imagine, who want to strive for kind of like the ideal future, and they think about, basic income as fitting into that. So is it helpful or not to think about basic income as utopian, and in what ways? Rutger Bregman wrote this book a while ago called Utopia for Realists. And he kind of puts basic income in a utopian framing in a positive way, where he tries to. And he also talks about some other things in there in his visions of utopia, of possibilities. So some of us read or listened to an interview where Ezra Klein talks to Rutger Bregman about this idea of utopianism. And his kind of utopian case for basic income, and as well as open borders and a 15-hour work week. So we can talk about all of that stuff today. So I want to start by going around the room and getting people's initial thoughts on utopianism and basic income. So we'll start with Derek, and then we'll go to Avi and then Bethany.
I think it's interesting to look at how people use the word utopia, because it's the way that it's used. You don't usually say, hey, that sounds utopian, let's go do it, that's awesome. It almost comes with it an automatic implication that there's a kind of unreachable quality to it. So Rutger Bregman's title, Utopia for Realists, kind of nicely solves that by clarifying, by qualifying and saying, well, it has to be achievable. And that makes sense. We all have nice dreams, but if they're not achievable, then they're not really considered worth discussing in serious circles. I guess I think there's a kind of opposite to utopian thinking that isn't talked about. We don't have a name for it. It's not dystopian, but it's a kind of automatic reflexive assumption that, well, the simpler or better or next step forward is obviously impossible. We're gonna be skeptical by default of something that sounds really good. And that's very common. That whatever that is, whatever you would call that, that seems to be the kind of default today. I think basic income faces an obstacle to the extent that it's perceived as utopian. And I think people that are in favor of it are going to have to really make sure that they're arguing with that in mind and are stressing what's actually achievable about it, because that's what's interesting about it compared to other plans.
Yeah, I think maybe that opposite is incrementalism or something along those lines. But I don't know. We'll talk about it more. Let's go to Avi and then Bethany and then Eddie.
So my kind of general initial thoughts on this is that, well, I do have an issue with the word utopia and the idea that humans can achieve utopia, because my understanding of the issue is that utopia is kind of this like fictional thing where everything's perfect and everything can get along. But I would argue that due to the nature of humans and due to us being so different and everyone having different kind of morals and ethics, et cetera, that a utopia is impossible unless everyone's like clones of each other or something like that. So while I would agree that basic income would create like a better world and like a more fair world, I don't think that, a utopia is possible.
Okay, that's interesting. And I guess that can kind of come back to what Derek was talking about what is utopia? Is it by definition something that's impossible? So let's go to Bethany, Eddie, and then Nick.
Yeah, so I can see pros and cons to thinking of UBI as utopian, but I think one thing I've taken from you in terms of your perspective is that it can be useful to think of it instead as something kind of like fundamental to at least a kind of economic system that we have. And so that might seem like a different framing than utopian, where when I think of utopian, I think of something that's useful to shoot for, but you might have to kind of take a lot of steps or change a lot of things or do a lot of work before you get there. And with UBI, I think that's true in terms of public opinion. But in terms of the mechanics of it, there's this other way of viewing it that that again I've gotten mainly from you, Alex, which is like it's actually just kind of like a missing piece that fits right in to the existing economic system and kind of fixes a lot of things in it. So it has a lot of benefits, but you might want to think of it like you often say as like I like thinking of it as a fundamental piece of economic infrastructure, which is your phrase. So if you think about it that way, it kind of feels different, even if it might have all these amazing effects, because it feels just like something we could theoretically implement now without changing a lot of other things that would then have these positive effects, as opposed to something that might take a lot of like effort and different kinds of social change or different kinds of changes to realize, which is kind of more what comes to mind for me when I think of utopian. So just one thought there.
Yeah. Let's go to Eddie and then Nick and then Richard.
So I think a utopia is kind of an imagined ideal future. And I think that in terms of UBI, most people who argue that UBI is an utopia from the negative perspective, have objections in mind, like they think that it will cause everyone to stop working, or they think it will cause an inflation. And if you look at those issues very carefully, it's clear to me that those are things that will not happen in the face of a monetary UBI. So in that sense, I think that UBI is really not that far from reality. It's something that would be simple to implement. And right now, the thing that stops us from getting there is just that people are afraid that those things will happen when in fact they actually won't, particularly because of the effects of productivity growth and the rising productivity of the economy. On the other hand, I think UBI is probably the one most, the broadest improvement on society that we could have, because it improves it on one hand from the aspect of eliminating poverty, and on the other hand, from transforming the way people work and would look for work to sustain their finances. Yeah.
Cool. Let's go to. Oh, thanks, Eddie. Let's go to Nick and then Richard and then Steve.
I don't know. It really depends on how you would define utopia. In Rutger Bregman's book, one of his main arguments is that compared to, say, antebellum era slavery, we are living in what they might consider a utopia back then. So you can only kind of wonder what they'll, people say 100 years from now will consider as a utopia compared to how we're living now. So it's really, I'm not sure if, that utopia where everything is perfect is possible, but we do know that UBI is just a really good first step toward just not saying utopia, but just making significant improvements to how we live now.
Okay, let's go Richard, Steve, and then Mitchell.
When most people think of utopia, they think of they express cynicism towards it with how are they going to benefit from it, rather than how I am going to benefit from it, or is everyone going to benefit from it in the future, or how long they have to wait, or something along those lines. But when I think of it, I think of universal basic income as a transitional step towards a Star Trek society with replicators and things like that. But even Star Trek has a lot of like seemingly redundant jobs and things, and I don't think they need anywhere near the number of people to perform the functions on the ships. But you just have to think about how things were in like the 60s, and then we're going to transition up to that in like 75 years until like the things that they have right now in Star Trek. It's back then, we need all these jobs, so now we still need all those jobs I don't know. It's just really weird.
Okay, cool. Let's go to Steve, Mitchell, and then Joan.
I don't think about the utopia too much because I'm a world-weary curmudgeon, bah humbug guy. And I don't think the world is in a very good place to, it's a lot of steps away from utopia. But I think that UBI is a very pragmatic and near-term solution, which might explain why when coronavirus stressed the status quo, everybody's reaction was UBI. It was print money and do UBI because it's that close at hand. That's it.
I love it. Let's go to Mitchell, Joan, and then Dan.
When I think of utopia, I think maybe ideals, and then just something that you strive towards and you always continuously improve. They kind of referenced in the audio interview, at least, that for the infinite gain and stuff like that, the long term, it's not defined endpoint where you're not playing for a short period of time.
Okay, let's go Joan, and then Dan, and then Martin.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I looked up utopia, and the origin of the word, it's from the Greek, which means no place or nowhere, but it's kind of a pun. Sir Thomas More wrote the first Utopia, and he made it a pun because the almost identical Greek word utopis means a good place. So in a way, he's using a title the way that you're talking about Bregman used, that he balanced off the good place with no place in one fell swoop by doing that. I had a couple of issues that'll come up, more than a couple, about this article, but the first thing that I would say is that this idea that human nature is driving the need for an ideal place. I would say it's rather that adaptation to community expectations, maybe, or to survival needs or something else. But I disagree with is it Bregman's idea that we are naturally good versus naturally bad. I don't think it's that simple, and I don't think that having come up through the formation of the attempt to form communes in the 60s, and I could see how those kinds of operations fell apart and why, and this whole idea of no hierarchy. Well, somebody manages, somebody rises to the top, somebody leads. Maybe it isn't the way that you remember it being in a hierarchy, but it will happen. So this whole premise of his, I really disagreed with right from the beginning, that a utopia is fueled by human nature's desire for good. Okay, so that's one thing, and I'll talk about other things that I saw in this article. But I did want to say one thing. I agree with Bethany that framing it the way that you frame it, Alex, kind of doesn't sidestep, but it kind of eliminates in a way all the baggage of that human nature. This is what is good for people, and instead focuses on how it actually works economically. And then the other stuff, and again, as Bethany said, that kind of comes out of it, but almost as a bonus and not as the main focus. And I think that's what will make it successful, to focus more on the economic operation of it, how it helps society economically. Yep, that's all. There'll be more, but yeah.
Okay, great. Let's go Dan, Martin, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing that I'm hearing from everybody, and it's based on the framing of the book that Bregman uses, is this notion of locating utopia in the future. And so I think that's a fundamental question that you have to ask before we even start to think about it, is sort of, where do you locate utopia? Is it in the past? Is it in the present? Or is it in the future? And related to that, is it a description of a place like the Garden of Eden, or is it a set of values and principles that kind of guide your society? And so I think an interesting thing is through the development of civilization, there's different views on this stuff. So when you think about the fall of man or the ancient myth of the golden age, that's locating utopia in the past. And so I think in recent history, we've had different views on it. Someone like Steven Pinker seems to locate utopia in the present, whereas Bregman is concerned about the future. People like, and so I think of it as more about a rediscovery of values. So kind of related to that, you had Carl Jung talking about that, as opposed to Nietzsche talking about the creation of new values at the end of the 19th century. It was sort of, the concept of the death of God and Christianity not being a fundamental ordering principle for society. And so how do we move forward? And he was thinking about creating new values that would guide our society, which is, kind of a utopian framing, even though he wasn't necessarily, I don't think he was necessarily talking about that. And so to me, the idea of utopia in the future seems to be striving towards something that we haven't achieved yet. But I think that as it relates to a lot of the current discussion about the types of things that we would want to see in a future utopia, they're sort of fundamentally rooted in kind of a hunter-gatherer conception, hunter-gatherer values that are part of our evolutionary history and are very, very, very old. And so some examples of that, these are things I wrote down because I had to formulate all this stuff. That basic income is sort of fundamentally a hunter-gatherer value because it emphasizes shared prosperity instead of hoarding resources and wealth. It emphasizes the concept of abundance rather than scarcity. It allows for more leisure and less work, which is something that many people have noticed, obviously through research, that hunter-gatherers work a lot less than we do in modern society. And a lot of the work that they do, like hunting and fishing, is what we consider to be leisure, which is kind of interesting. I know that a lot of basic income advocates are in favor of a land value tax, which I think is also kind of rooted in hunter-gatherer values, the idea that no one has private ownership of the land belongs to everyone. And so related not only to basic income, you also have, universal health care, which is, everyone's health is the responsibility of the community and no one is denied access. And the idea that you have communal raising of children. There isn't really the concept of a nuclear family. And so I think my ideas of maybe a utopia or just sort of the pillars of a 21st century society would be universal healthcare, universal basic income, and universal education as sort of guiding principles and values for our society. And so to the extent that we move towards more universal systems, I think we're sort of reintroducing what are ostensibly hunter-gatherer values or values that are rooted in the past in the future. And so sort of the framing of utopia as located in the future, to me, seems to kind of miss the idea that we might be in some ways returning to where we came from.
Oh, really interesting. Let's go to Martin, and then Elizabeth, and then Austin.
So when I think of, sort of this notion of utopia, for those who've known me from previous meetings, you understand that my notion of universal basic income is not in the near future, but I think of it as more a part of what some will call the fourth industrial revolution. And so from my perspective, sometimes I troll these PhDs over at Harvard over at MIT, who discuss papers in artificial intelligence and deep learning, and I truly troll them, right? It's like these guys really know what they're talking about, and I don't. But I will tell you that a takeaway from that is, well, the only reason I know what they're talking about, because I did do a little bit of artificial intelligence graduate studies, but I did them 25 years ago. And if 25 years ago, well, I could tell you that 25 years ago, the students in my classes, we didn't sit around talking about doing the kinds of stuff that's being done today. And it, forget why or whatever, it's just 25 years ago, right? We didn't see it necessarily. And in some ways, when I look back at what, what I see people doing today, what I see the kinds of papers these guys are discussing, and I even asked myself, how come we didn't think about some of these kinds of possibilities way back then? And there's a reason why we didn't, right? Some things have changed beyond the technology, big data and computing power, GPUs, blah, 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 all this boring stuff. But so since I'm sort of thinking about this, sort of from two perspectives. One, I'm thinking about it in a fourth industrial revolution sense, which is a society that is built around all sorts of intelligent machines, intelligent processes, with far less, if you will, requirements for human labor. And when do I see that as something that is possible? And yeah, I mean, I just look at what's going on, the kinds of things that are happening today that are mainstream. All of you read and see them. And then I think about some of the stuff that I see these guys talking about in papers that are decidedly not mainstream. Like you see systems that can do these just unbelievable things, but then it's tempered by these experiments where you're seeing these amazing things happen, cost millions of dollars in computing time in order to pull off the experiment. So it's like in a cost benefit analysis, the cost benefit isn't there. But then on the other hand, when you look at how you landed on the moon 50 years ago with the computing power that was available then, and compare that to the computing power that's in the iPhone 7 that I'm talking to you over, you begin to get this sense of, the possible. And so I do see a possible future. I don't see an inevitable future, but I do see a possible future. And that future that I see is not utopia. It's just well within the realm of possible, And and I do see a role for UBI or something like UBI, because otherwise there's a problem with that. What I see is really possible, but today we would almost still consider utopian society, is our current understanding, sort of notion, norms as they relate to work and what one gives to society, what one takes out of society, so to speak, or benefits from society. Maybe I shouldn't say take out. We need to rethink those if we're somehow to sort of figure out how we all exist in this, again, what some might call utopian, but actually could be a very real thing. We could build this fourth industrial revolution. It may build itself, so to speak, but we could actually be proactively going after that, thinking that, what would be wrong with that? Again, as it relates, or I should say from utopian, that framing, if UBI is framed as utopian, as rather than a sort of natural order of evolution, you might say, to me, that's a problem. Because you may have a solution, a completely viable solution, a solution that obviously I may think is a little bit further out in the future, perhaps than most of the other members of this group. But nevertheless, I see it as completely viable, and yet it will lose its viability in its branding of being utopian rather than something that we should think of just as natural as landing person on the moon with the computing power of whatever it was, 1969, whatever, versus the computing power in an iPhone 7.
Okay, good stuff. Let's go to Elizabeth and then Austin.
Yeah, I take a lot of people's points about the sort of problematics of framing it as utopian specifically, given how people often hear that and think, oh, it's like some impossible imagined thing, but I do really appreciate Bregman's framing about aiming for something positive instead of focusing on the negative. So being like, okay, what is the kind of society that we want to have? And then figuring out from that vision how we get there. And I mean, not that there isn't value in being like, okay, what are the literal problems that we have now and how do we fix them? But it feels really appealing to me to be like, okay, like let's really imagine in a broad, like nothing's off the table, what is the imagined perfect, maybe never quite attainable future that we want to have? And that feels like how you get a lot of that really big, exciting change is by imagining stuff that seems impossible. And like maybe some of it is, but like history shows us that a lot more of it is possible than people necessarily would have thought at the time. Like there are plenty of times when if you said like, oh yeah, could we land someone on the moon? People would be like, maybe if you believe in magic, but like that's not a thing that we have the tools to do. And so I really appreciate the idea of framing it as sort of dreaming big and thinking about the positive elements of humans and of society and their capabilities instead of focusing on like, well, okay, we know all these terrible things about human nature, so here's how we could maybe structure it to like work against that, but being like, no, let's really imagine a positive, beautiful world that we want to live in and how to get there.
Yeah, I think that's right. You can't move towards a better future unless you have an idea of what you're moving towards. Okay, so go ahead, Austin.
Hey guys, actually this is an interesting topic for me. When I started university, we had a really great professor of political philosophy who'd grown up in the former Yugoslavia and seen that fall apart. And so he had sort of experience of utopias falling apart and, you know, how these ideas can go wrong. But what he did was for our intro to political philosophy, he only assigned us 2 readings. And one was Thomas More's Utopia and the other was Machiavelli's The Prince, right? And it took me a long while to figure out what he was actually doing there. I took it as a thing about human nature. You know, Machiavelli thinks the prince thinks that people are evil and need a strong authority, you know, to control them. And Thomas More thinks that, you know, people are good and so we can have this wonderful free society. When you know a little bit more about Thomas More and how he used to burn people alive for not being Catholic, that becomes less tenable. But the point I think that was being made was that these are the 2 currents that make sort of modern political thought possible, right? So up until that point that we're living in these traditional societies where to figure out how to act and what to do, you look to the past. So you read the Bible or you looked at what people had always done traditionally and you mimicked what was in the past. And then the two sort of the positive and negative charge, if you like, the 2 elements that animate modern political thought are how are people right now, which is what Machiavelli was writing about. Like, what is the world right now? How does power actually work? And at the other end of that is like, what could it be like in the future? What do we want, right? So rather than the past, you look at this mix of the present and the future. And I think that sort of sets this, there's a sort of spectrum there, and ideas like a basic income or whatever move along that spectrum and start out at the utopian end and then move towards the pragmatic. They move out of the future and into the present, you know, relative to us. And I think that what we see now is we have what we've had for like the last sort of 30 years, like since Margaret Thatcher said something like, there is no alternative, was her famous line, is we have this overemphasis on what is the case now. And it can be hard for us to look past that. So when you see with Bregman, you know, he's this part of this millennial wave of optimism, which is saying, well, no, we have to, that's only half the picture, that we have to reanimate this other part of modern political thinking, which is imagining utopianism in the future. And yeah, you know, you start out, you know, when you go into, it's like when I'm negotiating with a developer and I want them to get some work done, they always say, when do you want it by? And I'm like, fucking yesterday, right? Like, how fast can you do it? You don't start by thinking what's realistic. You start by thinking what's ideal and then see how close you can get to that in reality. So there's the tension between these 2 things is productive. it's not necessarily bad to have that tension.
Okay, great. I love these points. So I think, when people imagine an ideal future, when people imagine a utopia, most of the things that people imagine are not things that can ever happen. They're impossible. And of course, we can look at society today and say, well, yes, this is an example of something that could have been thought of as a utopia by people in the past. I think that's true. But you also have to remember that there's any number of other scenarios that didn't happen, that couldn't happen. So it's easy to look back and see the progress we made and how amazing that must feel to someone who's thinking in the past. But most of that thinking is just not doable. And the word dystopia is interesting because it doesn't just mean like a really bad future. It means it implies that there's like a failure of utopia, that someone had this vision of an ideal future and tried to make it happen, and it resulted in everybody suffering. So that's like what a dystopia is, right? So there's this fear with utopian visions, or this concern that you're going to cause something really bad to happen, like Martin brought up Soviet Russia, which of course was based on a utopian vision that didn't pan out. Someone had this ideal of what they wanted the future to look like, but they weren't kind of grounded in the realm of reality. I like that Rutger Bregman tries to ground his utopia in reality. But when it comes to basic income, I don't think it necessarily helps the argument to kind of put it in utopian framing. I liked what Bethany said about it being basic income is kind of this fundamental part of the economic system. Like the fact that we don't have basic income is a way in which our economy is broken. And in any ideal utopia, of course, we're going to fix the things that are broken, but we should fix the things that are broken anyway. So I like to frame utopia in kind of this practical, prosaic, almost boring way. Like it's something I'm really passionate about and really excited about, but it's not, like I don't want it to be this like pie in the sky, fantasy about what our future is going to look like or something like that, if that makes any sense. So I think everybody brought up some really great points, and nobody has their hand up. So why don't we get to a quote from the article? Let's see. So, okay, universal basic income is all about freedom. That's the most important argument for it. It's about the freedom to make your own choices. It's about the freedom to say yes to the things you want to do, and it's about freedom to say no to the things you don't like. A boss that harasses you, or a wife or husband that you don't really like anymore. If we move to the details, most people would say it's a monthly grant enough to pay for your basic needs like food, shelter, clothing, and it's absolutely unconditional. So you can decide for yourself what you want to do with it. So I have a few objections to this framing. I do think that if you have more money and it's unconditional, that gives you a lot more freedom. Of course, that's true. I don't like to think about basic income as being, a certain amount of money, like enough to meet basic needs. It's a way of getting people money, right? So we have systems for distributing income to consumers. And then the question is, what's the most efficient way to do that? And basic income is one of our options. And I would argue that it is a really efficient option for distributing income to consumers. And yeah, freedom, it's not about freedom. It's about distributing money to people efficiently, which of course makes people more free. But I think this isn't the root of what basic income is about. And I don't think the most important argument for basic income is about freedom. The most important argument for basic income is that the way we get people money is broken, and we want to do it more efficiently. And of course, there's all kinds of costs and harm that's being done to humanity by the fact that that we're not getting people money efficiently. Okay, so a bunch of people have their hands up. Let's go to Bethany.
Yeah, so I think you could think about basic income in this way if you wanted to, like, and some people might, like you're saying, okay, the key thing that we're going to work backwards from is like how to cover whatever we consider people's basic needs. We're going to like pull all the stops everywhere else to try to like do that. That's not the way that I usually think about it. You know, another way to think about it is kind of like, how much money can we afford to give people? Is it zero, you know, unconditionally? Is it zero? Is it $12,000 a year? Is it $100,000 a year? You know, and what are we trading off with that? Like what are, you know, what are we doing instead? Or what would we have to change to give people $100,000 a year, 50, whatever it is. So that's kind of more how I think about it. But I guess you theoretically could think about it this way, and just see like what could we change to get to this particular number. I don't find it as like flexible, and I think you could end up limiting yourself more than you needed to. But it is, I think it does make sense as a different view than I would have about how to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Let's go to Avi.
So I definitely agree with what Bethany said. I view universal basic income more along the lines of like, how much can we give people? Because yeah, it's nice to have your needs covered, but if you can still sustain the economy and give even more than people, I mean, who would say no to an extra $200 or something like that? So I definitely don't frame it as like oh, as soon as we, you know, are done with our basic needs, like that's it, we'll stop giving people money. It's definitely whatever the economy can sustain, we should give that. And if it's not enough to sustain, like to completely get rid of poverty or whatever, like that's fine. We're at least part of the way through there. So that's my short little contribution.
Yeah, if we're doing the best we can, then that's the best we can do. And just because it might not be up to some level that we would like it to be at, you know, in kind of our ideal utopian vision or something like that, doesn't mean we shouldn't still do the best we can do. So I agree with you there. Let's go to Austin.
I would probably side more with Rutger Bregman and Carl Wildequist on this, in terms of my interest stems not from the macroeconomic picture, but from freedom, from the idea of wouldn't it be nice if people were free to make the better choices. You know, in the I quote, they mention people leaving marriages. And I think it's also important to note that, pardon me, I'm walking, so that's why I'm a bit huffing and puffing. That people will also probably, marriages also come under a lot of stress because of financial hardship. So giving people money may save as many marriages as it lets people out of. And that's a bit like a discussion that I've been having recently with some people on Reddit, is the idea that a basic income makes it easier for people who don't want work to opt out. And that in turn makes it easier for people who do want work to find it, because, you know, those jobs have just been vacated, right? And so in every case, I think you see the practical effect of a basic income is to increase people's freedom. And that's not a binary thing. It doesn't turn on at some magic number. It increases. The more basic income they have, the more freedom they have. You know, if it's very high, then you've got the freedom to travel and move house on a whim and, you know, all of those things, right? But the other thing I would add to that is that actually I think freedom and autonomy are efficient, right? Like you find, this is why is Airbnb overtaking the traditional hospitality market? Because it actually gives the people who are providing the accommodation have a lot of autonomy. Same with Uber, same with a lot of this new sort of what's called the sharing economy, which is a bit of a weird name. But what happens in that is you give the participants maximum autonomy, and actually that ends up being a really efficient system. And when you try and which fits with the idea that when people are doing what they want, they'll generally do a better job than doing something they hate, right? So I don't think there's a huge conflict between the idea of it being a more efficient system and it giving people more freedom. I think there's basically synergy there, and that in general, individual freedom is good for the group well-being as well. And basic income sort of, it contains both, you know, it's a twofer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Basic income does promote freedom. It actually, you know, it benefits people in a lot of ways. And if you go around and you ask basic income supporters what is the benefit of basic income, they'll rattle off a list of things. But you can also imagine a future in which we have basic income and everyone just kind of accepts it and it's normal. And then you could ask an ordinary member of society who's just used to basic income as part of their everyday life, what problem does basic income solve? And their answer is going to be, well, this is the way people get money. People need money. It's necessary for human society. And then you could ask them the question, what would happen if we removed the basic income? And then they could be like, oh man, we wouldn't have an efficient way to get people money. We'd have to kind of come up with these other things and, maybe make up jobs for people or have these, safety net support programs or, create a lot of lending in the economy so people can borrow money and make, overstimulate the financial sector. They're gonna have to kind of reverse engineer or engineer like what our world is with all of its failings due to lack of an efficient mechanism to get people basic income. And they're like, oh yeah, and there's going to be like tons of ways in which people just won't have the freedom to do what they want to do anymore and all that kind of stuff. But I think all of that stuff, including the freedom stuff, is secondary, right? It's not the fundamental problem that basic income solves. It's related to the problems that lack of basic income causes, if that makes any sense. I'll go back to you, Austin, since I just kind of pushed back against what you said. Austin, oh, you took your hand down. Go ahead, Dan.
I think Joan was first.
Go ahead, Joan.
Thank you. Yeah. So that's good that I'm coming right after Austin, because a lot of what he says is what I would have said, although not in that way necessarily. But I now that you've spoken, though, Alex, I can see that the doubleness of basic income in this regard. I guess I fall more on the side of, in this case, it solves the problem of lack of freedom more than it solves the problem of how to get money to people. That's how to get the money to people. You're like measuring two different goals in a way. And the goal of getting people the money is not, to my mind, the ultimate goal. I mean, the ultimate goal of people having more money is about having more freedom. I mean, I think that way primarily because I'm a writer, and I know writers and I know artists. And so if your whole life is geared toward how do I get money without having to give up my time, then you understand the importance of having, as Virginia Woolf says, a room of one's own. You need some kind of money. It doesn't have to be much. But in order to pursue what you want to pursue, and that's freedom, right? In order to pursue what you need to pursue, then you need money. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's a little bit circular. I understand that. But I think I would put, in this case, the author of the article as having more, I'm more in agreement with that ideal, that it solves that goal, that for people to have freedom who need it. Not everybody does. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right that, giving people money is not an end in itself.
Right.
So any, the ultimate goal for how we set up our society and our economy is to promote human prosperity and to maximize human prosperity, to make people as well off as possible. And freedom is a component of that. And money is a component, is part of the mechanism that
right.
allows our society and our economy to promote human prosperity. So I think there's a lot of benefits to having an efficient economy to people, and freedom is a huge part of that. But there are a lot of things that give people freedom. There are a lot of necessary mechanisms and components in our society and our economy to support people's freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Money is one of them, and basic income solves the money part of it. Yeah, does that make sense?
I would say that it solves for freedom. In terms of freedom, I would say it solves pretty much the whole thing. But that's in this society, in America. I mean, there are other infringements on freedom in other countries that it doesn't solve, of course.
Yeah, I mean, so for a counterfactual, you could say, well, if we put everyone in prison or we're just watching everyone all the time and
Yep.
and
Then
and
that's
you know
taking
limiting
away
what we can
freedom.
do. You know, you can give them a basic income. It's not, you know, there's still going to be
That's all.
freedom problems. Yeah.
Right. No, I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm talking about America though at this point, capitalism. Yeah.
Sure. So you're kind of looking at a world in which a lot of our other mechanisms are working correctly
Right.
to support people's freedom,
Yeah.
right? So we can also, like I was saying, imagine a world where we're living with basic income, and then what would people say is the thing that's needed for freedom or something like that if they have a basic income, but maybe they don't have some of these other
things. It's not
things.
much. It's not worth much if you're in prison. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's go to Dan.
Yeah, just that last thought makes me think of just right now, because I've been receiving unemployment for, what is it now, 4 months or whatever, but like you can't do anything because everything is closed and shut down. So we're kind of living that to some extent right now, which is kind of an interesting experience. But kind of my broader point based on the quote, kind of what came to mind is it seems like Bregman is sort of talking about two different things in the same paragraph. He's talking about sort of freedom, basic income being about freedom, which I would think about more as a utopian ideal, and then also talking about sort of the bread and butter, meeting people's basic needs. Like he says, most people, that's what they think about with basic income. And so I think the framing of meeting people's basic needs is something that's good for society, and basic income helps you do that. It's not it doesn't have to be a limiting thing, like what Bethany was talking about. It doesn't have to be limiting in that, okay, we've met everybody's basic needs, so now there's no reason to increase the basic income. But then along with that, you can get the byproduct over time with basic income of freedom, like more people experiencing freedom. And so I think it's definitely, I think both sort of framings have merit, and one sort of gets you out the door and gets you going and doing it. And then the other thing is the byproduct over time, which is kind of what utopia is, right? It's this sort of futuristic, that's how we always think about it. It's this thing in the future. So over time, more people will experience that that concept of freedom with a basic income in place.
Yeah, I think those are good points. Let's go to Austin.
A couple of things. First of all, I mean, this idea of prosperity versus freedom is an interesting, which is more important and which is the element that we're talking about when we talk about basic income. I just don't think that there's a right answer to that either, right? That's really very subjective.
I think you have an airplane flying overhead, Austin. You're kind of breaking up.
How about now? Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, I just had to turn my body so I'm shielding you guys from the sea breeze, which is hitting my microphone. What I was saying is that I don't think there's a real conflict between if there's a right answer, which is more important, freedom or prosperity. That's kind of, I don't think anyone has the answer to that. That's one of those debates that's been raging for thousands of years and will be ongoing. My tendency would be to come down on the side of freedom and say it would be better to live in a less wealthy society that had more freedom than a wealthy society that had less freedom. I think freedom is very important and valuable, right? But that's, you're counting apples and oranges, so it's hard to figure out what that is. But that I just don't think that there's a conflict either, which is good. So we don't have to make a trade-off because prosperity and freedom actually go together, right? And the other thing I wanted to say is that I actually agree in a sense with what you're saying about we don't want to put basic income too far off in the future. And in a sense, it's not really a utopian idea anymore. It's something that is very achievable and could have been done already, could have happened 50 years ago. We had the productive capacity. The scarcity hasn't really been a thing since the immediate post-war era. We've had the capacity to sort of overproduce since we've had that advanced tech that came out of out of the Second World War, more or less. We developed, planes and huge ships and massively powerful machines. And we also saw that we can supercharge the economy with government spending And since then, scarcity's just been a choice. So in a sense, basic income or utopia isn't a great conversation for a basic income group, because the basic income is not really a utopian demand. It's an immediate practical demand. And you hear that in the way people talk about it now. A lot of people who are like anarchists or have some other utopian ideology who back the idea will say, well, it's not going to solve everything, but it's a good short or medium term solution. It's a stepping stone. And that's what I think is interesting about basic income as well, is that you can have a lot of different views about what the ideal society is and still see a basic income as a step towards that, because like everyone will have more freedom. And when everyone's free, they'll do X, and X is whatever you think of human nature, right? So anyhow, and Bregman, one thing about Bregman is I think he's right about, he when he talks about human nature, he tends to say, oh, people aren't lazy, right? He tends to say, this is one point where I depart from him. He tends to say, well, people aren't lazy. It's okay. Even if they have a basic income, they'll still work. And I'm like, well, I don't care, right? I don't care, because we don't really need them to work. There's no shortage. Even if only 10 or 20% of society is industrious, or people are only industrious 10 or 20% of the time, that's fine. And human beings who are lazy, or as quote unquote lazy, that's not necessarily an evil thing. That's not that it's not noble to be industrious and evil to be lazy. So he, in some senses, he's not utopian enough for me. But yeah, a few things there.
Okay, I like the point that you made about freedom and prosperity. I would probably say that freedom is a component of human prosperity. Like, we want people to be as well off as possible, and freedom is kind of one component to that. So maybe freedom trades off with other components of prosperity, like you were saying, wealth, money, that kind of stuff. My sense is that these two things are generally not going to trade off against each other too much. The more money people have access to, generally speaking, the more freedom they're going to have, unless there's something about the way we've set up our money distribution system that that kind of gets in the way of people's freedom. If there's some other thing, that we do this thing and it increases money but decreases freedom somehow. I think most of the time, money on its own, especially if it's through basic income, you've got a mechanism for distributing money, and it's in a way that allows for the most freedom possible. Let's go to Richard.
Okay, well, the way people think of thought of the perfect utopian society in like the 50s and 60s, or through the spectrum of like conservatism or liberalism, is, well, for conservatives, it's like traditionalism, and how, well, based on that quote we had, they wouldn't want people to be able to divorce. They wouldn't want people to do various things like that. There maybe it would be more theocratic or something, because they don't want religion to lose its power in society. A Furby is as powerful as a Furby from 25 years ago is as powerful as the lander that landed on the moon in 1969. While a liberal society would be more inclusive and would want people to bring black people and white people and Chinese people or whatever, and Arabs and everyone else would be welcome into the society. But in the conservative society, they would want people, all white people having all the like white power and all that stuff. They would have they would exclude certain people that they don't like, would have the wrong religion or the wrong social background, or they were on their family did something bad, so now they're poor. Well, the liberal side, they may want polygamy or something. They might allow that. But it's just how people view the future. Like oh, we're going to land on the moon and we're going to have space domes with everyone living there or something. Or we're going to build, just going to stay on the earth and we're just going to have build all sorts of cathedrals and things.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a good point. And as it relates to basic income, if you're imagining a future with basic income, then you're at least imagining a facility or one institutional component of society that is not restrictive in this way. That's not restricting people to a particular type of behavior or a particular ideology or something like that. So I think it's very compatible with different people's ideas of what a good future would look like, if that makes any sense. I think obviously we need to, we want to try to sort things out in such a way that that we're valuing people as broadly as possible. At least I do. Some people just want certain people to be prosperous and that kind of thing, but that's not what I'm. And maybe those people would actually have a basic income just for their friends and that kind of thing, or their in-group or whatever. So I think it's true that whatever subset of humanity you care about, you could have a basic income for those people, and it would kind of efficiently support the people that you care about. I just happen to feel like all of humanity is worth caring about. Yeah. So let's go to Dan let's go to Dan.
Yeah, so the freedom prosperity trade-off I think is interesting because you have at one end of the spectrum sort of the person who's like dirt poor but is a nomad vagabonder type person, and so you might think of them as having no prosperity but ultimate freedom. And on the other end, the high-powered CEO who has all the money in the world but all these demands on their time, and someone might look at that and say that's a lack of freedom. And so I don't think that there's sort of an inverse or positive relationship between those two concepts. I think prosperity allows you to choose more freedom. And so, but that's still a choice that someone has to make. And so I guess thinking again, relating to utopia, maybe the ideal society is where people have the most choice to do what they want. And so what structures, what mechanisms, what features do we have in society that make that possible to the greatest extent possible? Because personally, I'm more of a leaning towards freedom as opposed to prosperity. So yeah, I just think that making that choice is kind of the aim, and not thinking about it as, well, if there's a basic income, then you automatically have more freedom. Because in a basic income world, that high-powered CEO still doesn't have more freedom unless he or she decides to change how they live.
Yeah, I like that. There's kind of like this meta level freedom, the freedom to choose whether you're going to have freedom in your day-to-day life. I think that's a good point. I think obviously the vagabond is better off if he's a millionaire vagabond, and the CEO is worse off if he has no money and is just being forced to be a CEO all the time. And there's also freedom on different dimensions. So there's freedom for how to spend your time, and then there's freedom for, okay, I have all this money, I have more choice in the stuff I have access to, the stuff I can buy. So there's freedom on different dimensions as well. I still probably wouldn't say that, I probably wouldn't put prosperity as the trade-off. I'd probably put wealth or money as the trade-off that's happening there. So you've got maybe some amount of prosperity, and then people are deciding to allocate that towards spending their time doing all this cool stuff, or maybe just acquiring more wealth and being a CEO and working 18 hours a day or something like that.
Yeah, because wealth is more objective and freedom and prosperity are more subjective.
Right. That's a good point too. Cool. Let's go to Austin.
Yeah, I think when we're framing this stuff, you've really got to be quite specific, or the question, right? Like when you're thinking about freedom and prosperity, you've got to be sort of careful about freedom and wealth, rather, which could both be considered elements of prosperity. Which is, that fumble there is exactly an example that, you've just got to sort of define your terms. And one of those distinctions to make is between individual and collective. So, the Egyptian society that built the pyramids was definitely richer than the societies that, its neighbors and the societies that it preceded, but it was arguably much less free for the individuals. So there might be a trade-off at the level of, some would argue that America's prosperity depended on collective, the holistic collective prosperity depended on, denying individuals in that society freedom, especially in the early period. I mean, that's a fact. There's a counterfactual argument that no, it could have been just as prosperous without being so unfree. But I think it's just, I guess what I'm saying is that when you're having this discussion, you've got to really define your terms, and I don't think you can answer sort of comprehensively and for every case and for all time. You've got to but when it comes to basic income, I don't see a trade-off at all. I see it improves both, right? Wealth and freedom. But there are, sort of weird edge cases. And you might say, for example, that we're all more prosperous because we have sort of property rights and national parks and stuff. But what that means is we lose that sort of nomadic freedom to just sort of move across the countryside, which is obviously, I think, appealing. I mean, if you see like Red Dead Redemption or something, I mean, I love Red Dead 2. I play it all the time. And one of the things that's great about it is this feeling of just sort of moving across a wilderness that is, sort of, that's the appeal. You can imagine a lot of people would see the appeal of a sort of a bare bones cowboy life being, even though I won't have, a big house, the sort of, or, a comfortable car or a soft bed, I'd have that freedom to sort of roam and interact with nature. And that's something that's sort of almost priceless. And so, I think it's important to maintain the division and the separateness of these ideas, even though there's some overlap.
Yeah, I like your point about how these discussions can get really complicated and semantically complicated and murky. And I also like your point that basic income kind of cuts through all that complexity like a knife, and it's just this really simple thing that's easy to understand, and it solves this really simple problem. So this is part of actually why I'm not super excited about the way people like Rutger Bregman approach basic income, because they make it more complicated than it needs to be, and it gets you into all these kind of murky philosophical discussions about human nature, or like what is the go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, the idea of a utopia should be like that. It should be something that's simple, because you remove the complication of how do we get there and how does it relate to the current system, and you just imagine exactly what you want, right? You imagine, okay, I'd like to live forever and I'd like to have infinite resources, and I'd like, you set that abstract sort of North Star of what's exactly perfect without having to worry about the complications of what's realistic. So you separate out the question of what's desirable from what's realistic first, and that's a tool of simplifying, right? That's a way of abstracting the problem and removing some of the moving parts and making it less cognitively difficult. So, I think Bregman kind of fumbles that to an extent, because he's constantly making, it's utopia for realists. It's kind of a paradoxical title, his book.
I think that's true. I think when you're imagining the future, you have to have some kind of model or kind of like theoretical framework for at least making the case for why what you're imagining is realistic. And I think even it's not an easy thing to do. And I think even Lenin and the communists in Russia, they thought they had this theoretical framework for something that would actually work. And they really, convinced a lot of people that this was a realistic, pragmatic thing that was also this ideal, and then it didn't work. So it's a really, really hard thing to do. So I think with basic income, the main argument that you have to make isn't anything about the benefits that it provides. It's not like, oh, this will give people freedom. It's not even, oh, this will give people money. I mean, like, I think people understand that. That's what basic income is. The argument that you have to make, the case that you have to make, is that it's possible, is that it's doable. And I think sometimes basic income proponents skip that step. And I think to some extent, Rutger Bregman, he talks about that a little bit, but it's not like the main case for basic income isn't like, oh, it's going to solve this problem, that problem, that problem, that problem. Even though that's why it's useful, because it solves those problems. But I think why it's useful is obvious to people, right? Like, oh, like, why don't we just give everyone money is probably something that everyone has thought of at some point in their life, right? And the problem isn't like they don't see the benefit of it. The problem is that they don't see the reality of it. They don't see it as something that's realistic. So I do like that he's trying to kind of ground things in reality, but I still think he's kind of framing it in this way that is not. It's really the argument is like, how is this realistic, right? So yeah, I guess that's kind of my little rant there. Let's go to Martin.
So I'm going to try to harken back to two things that Alex, you just said. One is there might be a small group who think it's okay for their group. I'm sort of vaguely kind of quoting, but I think the essence, you were sort of a little bit of tribalism could be out there. And and then the other thing, the realm of the possible, and from previous discussions, you probably sort of understand that I'm at a minimum a skeptic of your description of why it's possible. My own description of why it's possible is because it's possible in the future, because I believe that this fourth industrial revolution is something that could happen. And even if it's not only something could happen, it could be an organizing principle for how we think about what we would like to achieve in the future. And then rather than sit on our butts and hope it happens, and wouldn't that be cool, and we could all do other stuff every day, I'd say, hey, let's set about and build this fourth industrial revolution. To build that fourth industrial revolution, that's where I'm going to harken back to your point about, well, maybe there's this tribe that thinks it's okay for them, but not for everybody else, is how do you solve that problem? Because I think that's an actual problem or an actual challenge. And so, here I'll harken back to something I've said on a couple of occasions. We already know how to do that, okay? Because we already do it. And we do it through something called stock that generates a dividend. In other words, some people, and I'm thinking of someone I knew who was hanging out at a mansion for a while in Cambridge, not her mansion. It was a mansion that she used to like to describe as owned by a couple of trust fund babies. These were folks who had high-paying jobs in New York City that they didn't need. They didn't need them because they were wealthy long before they were wealthy the day they were born, when they inherited their trust funds. They worked to high-paying jobs in New York City because their wealth also enabled them to go to Harvard and all the other credentials. And then they worked with people like them who were, to Alex, your point a little bit, people who in their tribe could see why they want their chunk of, so to speak, okay? And these people, and I don't want to vilify them, it was a nice mansion, I went there, that their trust fund, I don't know the exact details of their trust fund, but if their trust fund was dividend paying stock, and they decided to wake up at noontime every morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon because they stayed out to 3 a.m. drinking all night, that would be perfectly okay, because they were going to make the dividend on the stock no matter what. And what was that dividend in that stock? Well, that stock was an ownership claim to something that was productive enough or profit generating enough that it paid a dividend. Not all stocks pay a dividend. But I think what my point is here is that we in present society are perfectly okay. We don't think about it every day, but most of us are perfectly okay with the idea that some people, sometimes on the basis of birth, which is by my way of thinking, not a great way to decide who deserves more or less. But in America, we are perfectly okay with the notion of if you're born to the right parent necessarily and or grandparent, they pass on to you dividend paying stock in sufficient quantities of this, you can get up and do what, talk about freedom, do whatever you like every day. And the only thing you don't have to worry about is whether or not you can afford it, because you own a piece of the, call it a piece of the economy or piece of the productive economy that pays you a dividend. We are perfectly okay with the idea of people getting up in the morning and deciding to do something productive, or maybe just deciding to hang out at the beach. They're going to get paid either way. And so from the, the standpoint of UBI, I'm not with you, Alex, on why it's possible. I am in the realm of it's possible, we're just not there yet. But in the sense of sort of like utopia versus practical versus tribes versus, the notion of UBI today would most likely be it's funded by taxes. And in most people's sort of popular mindset, taxes are things that are paid by people who are doing productive work, and then the UBI passes it on to somebody who is not doing productive work. Whereas what I'm looking at is if everybody owns a share of, and there are ways I think we could get there if we start today rather than 3 decades from now, where everybody has ownership in this productive economy. They simply receive a dividend, and that dividend is, you could call it UBI, but it's just something they receive because they have ownership in a productive economy, and it gets paid whether they get out of bed in the morning or not, just like a trust fund baby.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of 2 things that I'm going to kind of pull out of your comments there, and that is that we want people have access to benefit from society, and we also need to provide an incentive for people to contribute the kinds of things that they wouldn't just wake up in the morning and decide to contribute to society out of their own volition. And people brought up people being lazy before, right? Like, it's basic income and human laziness are not contradictory things, but the lazier people are and the less they naturally want to contribute the kinds of things we need them to contribute, maybe the less basic income we can afford because we need to do more to provide the incentive, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think we kind of frame a lot of the benefits that people get in terms of what's fair and what's just, like, you see people who are born into wealth and you're like, well, they didn't do anything to earn that, so it's not fair, or something like that. But then you can even bring that back to the incentives, like, oh, maybe we want to provide an incentive for people to be able to provide a lot of wealth to their children, right? And if you take that away, then maybe that's problematic or something like that. But I think these notions of kind of justice and what's fair are kind of they're heuristics for the kinds of things we need to believe in order to achieve certain incentives, and we don't always get it right. So in understanding whether we're getting it right, whether we're being kind of efficient in the incentives we provide for people and efficient in the benefits we can provide for people, we need to look beneath that. So yeah, those are, I guess, some thoughts that I had based on what you were saying. Let's go to Derek.
The conversation sort of moved on, but I wanted to add in a final note on the freedom question and to do kind of what Alex and Austin were doing, which was to complicate it a little bit and point out that people mean different things when they say freedom. And like when people tell me that UBI will give everyone more freedom, I absolutely know what they mean. And I think it's absolutely true. At the same time, there's a part of UBI that some people, it almost seems to be a restrictive idea for some people. And the way I look at it is that there's some things that we can really only get to enjoy once we've actually accepted the right restrictions. And in a way, you know, the idea of private property that you can exchange with money, that is a rule, that's a restriction. It prevents you from doing some other thing by just taking what's around. No, you can't do that. And that actually does have to be enforced. It's a rule that we sort of hopefully don't enforce on people, but we all accept because it enables us to suddenly do these other things that weren't possible if we don't have that system set up. And, you know, conversely, if we accept the wrong restrictions, if we accept the wrong rules, there's all sorts of games that we'll never be able to play. And I find that a lot of the people that some people consider utopianists who I talked about UBI actually are against it, precisely because accepting the idea that it works and works well implicitly restricts or removes a different model that they have of how they want society to go, how they think we should all try to achieve a more ideal world. It will close off some possibilities in the same way that UBI may close off or make unnecessary many other things that we do today that people are doing that maybe they don't have to do or won't have the fiscal space to be able to do them anymore. So I'm very interested in the idea of just conceptually accepting restrictions, but the minimum number and the right amount, the right ones, to see if that actually sort of generates a net increase in freedom or a new type of experience that otherwise would not have been available if we pursued more raw freedom.
Yeah, I like that, because there's always going to be constraints, and the question is, what are the optimal constraints for us to choose in our society? Yeah, let's go to Dan.
So related to the justification for basic income kind of line of thinking that seems to be very common, and I agree with you, Alex, that it's a hindrance towards sort of pushing forward, and it's not the right way of thinking about it. We don't need to justify why people should receive money, but I think it's based on sort of the opening of Bregman's book, where he sort of repeats sort of the Hobbesian myth of, you know, life before the state was it solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And so we sort of we still operate, especially in a lot of places in academia, I think, and this is where this kind of justification argument tends to come out. We still kind of operate under this notion that the state justifies its existence by saying if it wasn't around, then people would be lost, people would go to war with each other, people would, kill, rape, and pillage each other, things like that, these sort of extreme things. And so if your fundamental premise is people need the state, and then basic income is saying the state is providing a basic amount of income for people, you then have to justify why the state needs to give people this money, or you have to come up with a reason for it, I think, as opposed to, because I think of basic income as being more of a decentralization, or it's a move towards decentralization and less reliance on the state. And so that's kind of why that's part of the reason why I sort of reject the notion that you need to justify its existence. I think it's a hangover from kind of some of the basic philosophical assumptions of Western civilization, that we have to justify everything that the state does for people because people need the state, and if they didn't have it, then everything would collapse and be crazy.
Yeah, I kind of like that reversal there, because if you think about basic income as something the market needs in order to be efficient, like people need money in order to be able to buy things, then you can say, oh, well, what's the mechanism by which we're going to get people that money? And then you might say, oh, well, maybe we need institutions. So maybe there's a role for the state to provide that money. So it's not, you don't start from, oh, we need a state to manage people. You start from, oh, we need a basic income. Let's have the state do that. Right.
Right. That's
like
exactly it. Yep.
Yeah. So let's go to another quote. And Austin and Martin have their hands up, so feel free to continue with what you were going to say after we read this quote. So here we go. So this is first it's Rutger Bregman, and then it's Ezra Klein. So Rutger Bregman says, one example is poverty. Often when people talk about poverty, they say we need to help them, that it's terrible to live in poverty. In the book, I try to use more right-wing entrepreneurial language and say poverty is just expensive. We can't afford it. It's a different kind of language. You could do the same thing with patriotism. And then Ezra Klein says, I actually think that's a very weak position to argue from, because as soon as somebody puts forward a study showing the opposite, you're screwed. The thing that I like about your book is that it's about a vision of what society should be. It's about human dignity. It's about giving people a platform on which to stand, to live a flourishing life. It's not an investment, and it's not a form of charity. It's a form of constructing a society that we collectively think is just. And I worry that you're falling into the trap when you're arguing based on rates of return. So I think this is an interesting point. There are a lot of arguments for basic income that are, they're based on things that are probably true, but maybe, you could discover that it's not actually true. Like, what if it were true that you give people a bunch of money and they spend it all on booze and drugs? What if it is true that, society as a whole saves money by keeping certain people poor, and you kind of have to do that in order to provide motivation for the other workers to make everyone else even richer or something like that. So I think we need to be very careful about, having like a laundry list of justifications for basic income, because if you glom onto one of them, like, oh, we should have basic income because robots are taking the jobs, and then, like, obviously this is a complicated issue, and a lot of people might say, well, wait a minute, maybe the robots aren't taking the jobs, and then you get into an argument about whether robots are going to take the jobs, when really basic income does not at all depend on that. Or maybe you think it does. I think, probably Martin thinks it does, but I'm not in that position. I don't think that basic income, the justification for basic income depends on robots taking jobs. And I'm not interested in getting into an argument about whether robots are going to take the jobs. I mean, actually, sometimes I am, but I'm not interested in getting into that argument, in terms of why we should have basic income, right? Because I think of basic income as this mechanism that gets people money efficiently, and that's true whether robots are taking the jobs or not. It's true whether people are lazy or not. It's true whether people are going to be irresponsible with their money or not. It's true whether poverty is expensive or not. So I think Ezra Klein is making a good point here. But then he's also kind of like falling back onto this justice angle, which Rutger Bregman is very much about. And I think in terms of what we think is fair or not, that's kind of a heuristic that allows us to quickly assess whether something is the right course of action, or deciding on the appropriate course of action. Is this fair? Is this just? That kind of thing. It doesn't necessarily reflect what gets you the optimal outcome all of the time. These are kind of like automatic judgments that we make. They're shortcut intuitions. So you can't, if you're trying to really think deeply about whether something makes sense for a society, you can't fall back onto justice, because justice and fairness are kind of they're shortcuts, right? So you got to think deeper than that. So yeah, so a bunch of people have their hands up. Let's go to Austin first.
Yeah, I really go the opposite way to you on this. I really don't think justice is a shortcut to anything else. I see it as a goal in and of itself. And so I guess I'm agreeing with Ezra Klein in that quote, that you don't want to have all these sort of practical, or all the practical arguments about UBI to me come secondary to whether it's the right thing to do, right? Whether it's morally sound. And I think it is. I think kindness is a virtue. And I think it does come down to these. What we were saying earlier, you were saying that, the point is to convince people it's possible because everyone automatically agrees it's good. I don't think that's the case. So, and that might reflect where I am. I'm in Australia, right? So at the moment, we're only 30 million people or something. 1.5 million of us are on a above poverty wage unemployment payment. Another 5 million are on a wage subsidy that's even higher than that, right? So you've got a third of the population currently living on unearned income. And I think and then the government just announced it's going to increase military spending. And I think everyone kind of knows that we could do a basic income here. You don't really get that pushback that, oh, we can't afford it, right? And so what the question becomes is, well, why don't you want it, right? And then it becomes about this thing of, oh, people are lazy. You'll have all these bums sitting around smoking pot, doing nothing, right? And so it becomes this question of, what do we consider virtuous as a society? How do we consider what's virtuous in an individual? And at the moment, industriousness and discipline are things we like. We like work, we like discipline, we like structure. We're attracted to those things at a sort of pre-rational level. And that's the level I feel like that we run into, that where the work has to happen. Well, I tried a thing where I posted on Facebook, and my friends are fairly progressive, open-minded people. And I said, just imagine you had $10 million, right? Which is not enough to do anything, but it's definitely enough to live the rest of your life without working. What would you do? And the only thing that a few people said was, I would buy a house and then ... Right? People didn't have an answer for what they would want, what they would do without the structure of the labor market. So I think, firstly, people say, oh, everyone else would be lazy and they just sit around at home. But I think that's also a projection that they're worried that that's what they would do. That in a sense, they want the discipline of the labor market to stop them being lazy and selfish, because they're worried that they will become something that they don't admire, that they will become this fat slob who, does nothing all day, right? And that they want to sort of, they're worried about the kind of person the society produces and whether they find that person. And what if we instead say, no, creativity and kindness, these values are more important than industriousness and discipline. Industriousness and discipline, these are good as means to the ends of achieving your creative goals and means to the ends of, being kind to other people because you can, produce stuff and then give it to them, right? If you have to start at that base sort of irrational level where you're just like, well, what do you actually want? And I think that's a really difficult question if you ask people, right? If you take people off their hamster wheel, if you can try and get them off the thing of, well, I've got to do all these things, and say, well, if you didn't have to do all those things, if you could do anything, what would you do? That's a terrifying question for a lot of people, right? And so I always say that the thing about a universal basic income is that it would create a massive existential crisis. But for me, that's a feature, not a bug. I think that's what we've got to go through as a society. So, sorry, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but the point is that I think it's this deep. I think justice is the deeper question than sort of effectiveness. Right? It's easier to say that it's doable. The hard question is what's desirable, and that's where utopias, I think, are actually really useful, because you're playing in that space of pure imagination. By the way, in the Soviet Union, they were talking, utopian science fiction writers were there talking about, well, we're going to bring back all the dead, right? Like their goals were like sky high, right? Like Soviet science, not only is it going to put a man on the moon, it's going to keep us all alive, and then it's going to bring all the people who were previously dead back to life, and it's going to turn every planet into a livable planet. It was the utopianism was like off the charts. And I'm not saying that Soviet Russia was great, obviously, right? But I'm saying that there's something to that, that the pureness of that utopianism, which is worth thinking about at least.
Cool. Yeah, I just had an idea for a dystopian Soviet Russia zombie movie. Yeah, I mean, I think you're making a lot of points that a lot of people would make, and a lot of people feel kind of feel this way, that justice and fairness and morality are kind of these basic things. But I would ask some questions, and we don't need to answer them right now. One is, why do people care about bums sitting around smoking? Why do we care about the kind of people that society produces? And I would argue that these kinds of base irrational judgment type things are still a matter of internalized incentives. So even though people in their moral judgments aren't thinking about we need people to behave in this way for maximum efficiency and prosperity, the reason why our moral structures are the way they are is to provide constraints for human societal cooperation, and it's all kind of internalized heuristics. So then we can ask the question, to what extent can culture change? And I think, to a large extent it can, and then maybe there are some things that are really biologically rooted rather than culturally rooted, and that kind of thing. So these are all really interesting questions.
Can I respond really quickly?
Yeah,
really quickly, that I want to respond. Okay, so this idea that morals have a biological root, I agree with that. So like we don't like lazy people.
Cultural root.
Yeah, or well, via culture, right? The idea that we need people to work because the group won't survive if it has, takers, and so therefore we develop this moral system. I think it's a bit like sex. So sex starts out as the need to reproduce, but it's really its own thing as well, right? Now, most of the time when people aren't having sex, they're like, okay, time to have another baby, right? They're having sex for sex's own sake. So it begins in this sort of evolutionary place where it's necessary, for genes to propagate themselves or for the group to continue.
So let me interrupt you, because I think I know what point you're trying to make, which is that maybe some of these moral judgments are so deeply internalized that we can't really change them. So we need to find a way to satisfy them and still achieve optimal outcomes for society. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying we have to change them. I'm saying we have to do the hard thing and change these really deep things. And everybody's got to take acid and go out into the desert and and face their inner self and blah blah blah. I'm saying we've got to do that hard, sort of almost spiritual work of changing our deepest moral impulses.
Okay. Well,
Dan was talking about Nietzsche. And reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra is probably a good place to start.
Okay. All right. So a lot of people have their hands up, but we are getting towards the end. So we're going to go around and get final comments from everybody. So we're going to start with Derek, and then we're going to go to Bethany and then Eddie.
This always catches me by surprise. I think this was really interesting. I think it brought up a lot of cool stuff associated with basic income. Something that got mentioned a lot was comparisons to utopianism and Marxism and socialism and that kind of thing. I think it's really interesting that that's sort of where that's basically in the back of your head whenever you're talking about utopianism these days. But funnily, it was sort of explicitly very anti-utopian in the way it was first described. Marx rejected a lot of people before him on the grounds that they were utopianism. A lot of socialist theory is actually all about, paradoxically it seems, accepting the hard, inescapable truth that there are these bad guys controlling the money system and we have to shut them, and you can't even talk about your crazy dreams until we do that, which is interesting. There's layers of this. You can be a utopian who doesn't think they're a utopian, who's arguing against other utopians, that kind of thing. So I don't know, I on where maybe that intersects with the debate about what's moral and what's just, what's virtuous, is that those are hard to unravel. People have different ideas about what they are. Some of it's baked in, a lot of it's cultural, maybe some of it's biological. It's a big fight. And I find I can avoid some of that by trying to look at what's helpful. Because what's helpful is somewhat empirical in a sense. You can kind of look at it. You can look at a system and say, well, what's the output of this system? Is this helping people or not? People can sort of come to a little bit more agreement intuitively about what looks helpful versus what does not look helpful. And, I don't know. It could be that, let me just put it this way. If we have these sort of baked in heuristics or deep cultural lore that we have to establish, whichever way you want to look at it, I would hope that what turns out to be just turns out to be helpful. And if it doesn't, then maybe I don't have much use for it.
Yeah, I like that way of putting it. Let's go to Bethany and then Eddie and then Richard.
So I started out by talking a lot about your views, and Alex ended up talking a lot about my views because I study incentives and morals and stuff like that quite a bit. But I think that in the article, even we didn't get to this quote, but he does acknowledge that people's beliefs, ideologies, behaviors are highly influenced by the circumstances that they're in, locally and broadly. And I think that is a really important point when we're thinking about utopianism, because you can't just take kind of morals, ideologies, behavior as it is now and assume it's going to be the same in a different situation, for better or for worse. So there's maybe more possibility that it could change, and also it could change in a negative way, right? So you know, if you change circumstances around in the wrong way, and in terms of the value of work, I think I'm a little bit with Alex that I think personally in our current society, even you advance yourself and even survive generally by espousing a strong work ethic. And that depends a little bit on where in society you're born and things like that. But that's a strong reason to espouse it, is that it's going to get you ahead in your job, in school. You know, you get in school first, and then you have more options for jobs, and then you can earn more money, and then you'll advance in your job, and so on. So I think there are a lot of reasons why we've deeply internalized those beliefs. I don't think they would totally go away in a different situation with basic income, because you know, it's nice to have a spouse who can get things done. It's nice to have a friend who can get things done. So I think those beliefs will stick around to some extent. But the idea that it has to be through a labor market job, I suspect that would eventually shift with a different kind of economic model where that wasn't so important to your well-being. Now, I'm not necessarily against us in that it might take some effort, like it might be deeply internalized now. There might be kind of like a transition to make. But that's my view of it. And in general, with utopianism, I think that's something that's really tricky to project into the future, not just what could be possible in terms of the government being different or the economics being different, but then how is that going to change people's ideologies and how they behave? I think that's really important to understand. And same with basic income.
Yeah, good stuff. Let's go to, and I meant to, I should have mentioned that I was kind of like talking about your stuff when I was talking about the internalized incentives of morality and all of that. This is what Bethany does. She works on this stuff. So let's go to Eddie and then Richard and then Steve.
So I really like what Austin was saying about the existential crisis that will fall onto society if as we get moved to UBI. I've seen people on Quora talk about how they reached a point in their life where they were wealthy enough and they realized that they could work as much as they wanted or as little as they wanted. It had nothing to do with how much income they were bringing in, and it was completely just a choice what they did with any of their time. And so I think UBI would definitely all of society to some degree. What to do with time.
So I missed part of what you said there. You said UBI would something to all of society to some degree.
UBI would place that situation on all of society, where people will have to deal with if all of our time is not required for just producing stuff that we need to live with. What will we do with our time instead? In terms of talking about UBI as a way to get money to people, I think that it is still something that you really cannot divorce from productivity growth. So if you think about 300 years ago in agrarian society, it takes all of the resources of society just for everyone to get fed. 90% of the economy is just producing food for people to eat. And in that society, if you had given people UBI, it would do absolutely nothing except raise the price of food, because that's all the food that was produced at that time. And in a related way, I think that the move to UBI actually will not happen so much from dreaming about utopia, although that's a good thing in itself. I think that it will actually happen more from a falling into dystopia. I think that most people, when they think about the future, they sort of project where the present is headed, and they kind of project that outwards, and they think the future is going to be kind of more of the same of what's going on right now. If you look at the economists who sit, or the the guys who sit on the board of the Federal Reserve, and they have projections, and it's funny, I've been following them for 10 years, and you eventually figure out that the long run projection is always 3%. And then the short run projection is just whatever is going on right now. And you draw a straight line from what's going on now to, eventually getting back to 3%. And that is what the projections generally look like. But I think we're in a situation really where productivity
You're talking about
growth,
like the dot plots and 3% interest rate and that kind of
the
thing?
dot plots. Yeah, the dot plots on the Fed Reserve of what the future GDP growth is going to be, in the long run,
GDP
3 years
growth,
out,
okay.
5 years out. And it's 5 years out or longer, it's always 3%. That's always the projection. But my point is that with the current system is broken, and the productivity growth, it introduces that people think that automation, that you have to realize, which is another way of saying productivity growth, is that there is a free market in labor supply and labor. And so, rather than causing unemployment, the first thing that it causes wages to go down really far. And it causes them to go down to the point where they can't go down any further. And then you reach a crisis. So I think that's where we're at. And I think things will actually become worse, and we'll start feeling enough pain that will, that society will just be kind of searching everywhere for solutions. And that's actually how we get it. But the utopianism thinking is great for other reasons, for also for thinking where we want to be in the future, where we do want to be, rather than where we're actually headed. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't share your confidence that landing in a dystopia will suddenly wake us up to trying to get out of it. But maybe. Let's go to Richard, and then Steve, and then Joan.
People are indoctrinated into the society where they're born. Like in, say, America, they're probably going to be Christians of some sort, or in India, they're going to be Hindus, or well, you get the idea. But if you break that up with, say, parental licensure or something along those lines, you can, and then sending those children away to the schools where they're raised by teachers who believe in the society, that could break up the issues surrounding a society. They can be reformed into being something completely different, like the whole acid and going into the desert thing or whatever. And like going back far enough, chimpanzees, which share most of our DNA, they had wars and things, but there's also bonobos, and they also share a ton of our DNA, and they use sex and things to relieve all the tension in their society. And there's also, going back even further than that, there's baboons, and they're like the humans of the distant past. And I mentioned this before, but there's a society of baboons where there was toxic trash, and all the alpha males and things ate the trash and they died off, and all the beta males and things were, well, dominated by the women, and they had a much kinder society and whatnot. And it survived with new members coming in and members leaving. It just continued onward.
Yeah, I like the point about different moral systems emerging in different cultures, and that lets you, that at least gives you some hints as to what kinds of things are biological and what kinds of things are maybe things that can change depending on the circumstances. So let's go to Steve, Joan, and then Dan.
So I'm on record as describing UBI in a very economic way. The mandate of the Federal Reserve is to maximize production while controlling inflation. The best monetary policy to accomplish this is what we talk about, is printing money and distributing it as a UBI. That's it. This is how I avoid having to smoke peyote and wander the desert, because I keep it that simple and that down to earth.
There you go. Yeah, actually, technically, the Fed also has a mandate to promote full employment, and I'm not happy with that. Let's go to Joan, Dan, and then Martin.
Yeah, so a lot of things came up that were interesting to me. The different kinds of freedom, the freedom of the bum on the road versus the freedom or unfreedom of the CEO versus prosperity versus, you know, freedom, all of that stuff. But really, I mean, the article was about achieving utopia, and we really never did agree, and maybe wouldn't agree on what that looked like. Different people, as I think Richard pointed out, you know, you could have Christian groups that feel like utopia is everybody's married, never gets divorced, people go to church, you know, that's their utopia. So all of these expectations about what a utopia is, we are not really we didn't really explore that, and we didn't really explore the idea of the nature of people, because Bregman believes that people ultimately are good and will strive for dignity and strive for kindness in a utopian society of his vision. But I'm not, you know, I'm not certain that I agree or that other people would agree with that vision of people being good. So, you know, there were a lot of things that we dealt with, but there were also a lot of things that we didn't deal with. And I would argue that we could talk more about it, but really good discussion. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot here. Let's go to Dan, and then Martin, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, so two final thoughts on the morals thing, you know, kind of morals and values. Yeah, I definitely think, you know, people should read both Nietzsche and Jung to get kind of two perspectives on what people were thinking at the beginning of the 20th century about kind of how we move forward. And then related to the thread about justifications of basic income versus effects. I think, you know, as we talk about basic income as a feature of the economy, the sort of policy solution mentality is kind of what pervades most of the thinking. And so the positive effects are what justify the reason for it. And so that's kind of what Ezra Klein was talking about in that last quote. Like, it's, you have to have, there's got to be some definable positive outcome for this, you know, policy for us to do, or this, you know, policy or program or whatever to implement it, sort of a priori. Like, before we do it, we have to know that this will have this sort of effect before we do it. And kind of thinking about that, one of the things I like, every time I see an article about, you know, the headline that says, does basic income work? I'm waiting for an article that just says, like, the debit cards were reloaded or the checks cleared. It's like, that's how you know that it worked. It's like, there's no, there's nothing beyond that. And there's always these, you know, long articles about, well, this country tried it this way and we saw these kinds of effects, and we also, these positive effects, but we also saw these potentially negative effects. And yeah, I just think that that's a big, when we're talking about changing morals, values, ways of thinking, that's another thing that's going to be hard to change, is just this notion of the effects are byproducts, and it's good to have those experiments and to know what happens in certain situations, but we don't need to focus on those as being justifications for implementing basic income. So those are kind of my closing thoughts on that.
Yeah, cool. Let's go to Martin, and then Elizabeth, and then Belinda, if you have any thoughts. No, not, we're going to skip Belinda. We'll just go straight to Austin after that.
So a couple of thoughts. First thought is there's an institution called the Roosevelt Institute that there's been some research there. I'm sure there's lots of other places that have tried to literally research this notion of what would people do in a UBI sort of economy. This whole idea of would they work, would they sit around, and so anyway, you can look at that, and I would think that some of the conclusions are that it's a mistaken notion that people would just sit around and do nothing. And I would also offer, only by observation, that some people either have or know they are going to inherit a trust fund and still go to college and then go to Harvard Business School and then work in investment banks on Wall Street. Not because they have to, but for whatever reason, they just sort of felt like doing it. We mentioned Soviet kinds of stuff. For anybody who misses or missed the Soviet Union and didn't get all the Soviet and Russian mysticism and all that they ever could have hoped for, I don't know if you can read the title. This book is called, what is it called? Plots Against Russia, Conspiracy and Fantasy After Socialism. So if you didn't get your fill of Soviet plots and mysticism and conspiracy theories and everything else, here's a pretty good book. All the ones you wish you'd gotten during the Soviet era and decided to get it afterwards. And anyway, so but a little bit of sarcasm there aside. Again, the notion, if this was really about utopianism, is, I think I personally think that there is a way to the end, so to speak. I think it would be a great endeavor of any sort of country or society to endeavor to a UBI sort of society. I happen to believe a little bit okay with some of the Roosevelt Institute research and also stuff like, people do all kinds of work who don't have to do anything. And so if you see some examples, then that means that this is not necessarily going to be an intolerable society where we let robots do a lot of the work. We let a certain amount of intelligence, artificial intelligence, and all do a certain amount of the work, and sort of let human creativity work to its maximum.
Okay, there you go. And if anyone's interested, you can Google Vladimir Lenin is a mushroom. Let's go to Elizabeth and then Austin.
Yeah, I appreciated the conversation. I definitely still have a sort of like a strong bias towards framings about like positive futures, but I appreciate a lot of the conversation about like why that's not necessarily the most helpful way like to frame this particular issue. So I appreciated the helpful conversation. As a like super radical lefty Christian, just wanted to like riff off of Joan's point and be like, Christians, like all groups, like definitely not a monolith. Like my ideal Christian utopia would be different than a lot of other people's Christian utopia visions.
Okay, let's go to Austin. Final thoughts.
Yeah, in sense of just talking about utopias, I think they're really good. They're a good mental exercise. It's like, you make a simplified economic model, not because you think it represents the world exactly as it is, but because it allows you to focus on a particular question. And that question might be, what do we actually want? So I think that's worth doing. And that's where you get to this deeper, that's why, I feel like this conversation leads into these deeper moral and ideological and cultural questions. And of course, someone saying, I think someone pointed out, it's going to be difficult to change a lot of people's minds. One thing I think is that really what happens is there's generational change, right? Really, most people don't change that much. I mean, there's some extraordinary people who maintain neuroplasticity late into life, but that's, those are the exceptions. Most people, by the time they're even, in their late 20s, they've kind of formed their worldview. So you have this limited window, which also means that I don't think we can take too much from the examples of, okay, we did a basic income trial and people kept working, or like rich people keep working, because they're living in a society and they're part of a generation where the norm is that you have to work. And if you don't work, you're a bad person. And I think over time, if we had a society with a UBI or, you know, some of these other more utopian ideas and institutions, you would see those values perhaps change more radically and dramatically. Yeah, and so, and then there's the question of, well, does it matter? Like, what do we think? Do we think it's good for people to work even if they don't have to? Or do we think that's foolish and that's them sort of squandering their life when they could be, you know, reading philosophy and taking peyote in the desert?
Yeah, good stuff. I like to say that if your basic income isn't causing people to quit their jobs, then your basic income isn't high enough. And just to kind of call back to Dan's point at the beginning about you know, hunter-gatherer societies and people not working as much, there's no reason to expect why, and also the types of work they did is things that we might consider leisure today. There's no reason to expect that you know, as culture shifts, we can't get back to a place where the labor-leisure balance looks a little more like that. At least, you know, there's a concrete example we can look at, or maybe we can push it even further. And, you know, there's all kinds of, you know, possibilities here. So this was a good discussion. I think I don't like framing.
Did you get to everyone? Did you get to Avi? I forget.
Oh, because Avi came back.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Avi.
Awesome. So yeah, I came back for the last part, but I thought this was overall a really good discussion. I liked hearing like the different views on whether or not UBI should be used just to basically satisfy everyone's needs, or as Alex said, UBI should be used to maximize the amount of money given back to people. And yeah, overall, I just loved hearing what everyone had to say on the subject.
Okay, great. And there actually are a couple final thoughts from people on the live stream. So David is saying, you know, people believe there's a moral hazard in giving people money. If we do, then we won't build a working society. No arts, no construction, etc. So that kind of gets back to our incentives. Like, what's the right balance of incentives there? And he says, although I agree with Alex that I believe if we convenience the world if we convince the world that UBI is possible and let people decide if we should or shouldn't implement it, we will decide to do it. It's compelling. Well, I hope we can make it compelling. And then Mitch is on the live stream too. He says, I've been spending about 4 or 5 months out of each of the past 2 years purposely unemployed because I like working as little as possible. Reasonable. I felt guilty at first, but it's really bliss when you're over the judgment from other people. More people should try it. Yeah, so there's maybe some cultural shift happening before our eyes in real time. So I don't like framing UBI in utopian terms because I think it's a very practical, pragmatic thing that works. And you know, you have to answer this question of how are you going to get consumers money in your society? And basic income can be the answer to that question. So next week, the topic is geographic mobility. So what kinds of things constrain people's ability to relocate, and what are the consequences of that? Where does basic income fit into the picture? And how can we help people be more mobile if that's a thing we want? So the event is not up, but I'll have it up later tonight. I've already picked the article. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Alex.
Good to see you, Mom, and
All right.
Courtney. I see Courtney in the background.
Yeah, I love your wall. That's a great